So I was talking to the high school class about a potential prank and it didn't come to fruition, but I'll try again next week. Anyways, good to be here with you all. Hope you had a good day. We'll go ahead and start with a word of prayer. Father in heaven, we're grateful once again to be joined here together and to study a portion of your word and pray that you help us understand that. And God, we're so thankful for just the example of your Son, and we pray that you help us to seek and save the lost the way that he did, Lord. And pray that you help us to glean what we can from that example seen here tonight in this text. And we pray you be with those that can't make it tonight for whatever reason, that they might be back with us again next week. And thank you most of all for the sacrifice of your Son, and it's in his name we pray. Amen. All right, so we'll go ahead and start in Luke chapter 19, and that's where we'll be the whole time, actually. Luke chapter 19. And again, so far we've talked and looked at different scenarios. You know, we've talked about the woman by the well, and the demon-possessed man, and the rich young ruler, and the man who had a son that had an unclean spirit, and his struggles with doubt. We saw Jesus cleanse the leper, and what we can learn about dealing with people that might have things about them that are difficult to be around or relatively unpleasant. We talked about Jesus and the curious, and tonight I want to talk about Jesus and the despised. And when I was thinking about the hardest things when it comes to being a Christian, what makes being a Christian hard, or what makes that decision difficult to commit your life to Jesus, I think a lot of us made that decision so long ago. It's been a while for many of us here that we kind of forget what were some of the dilemmas in making that decision. And I guess if I think about it for a while, I was pretty young, so there's always, what will my friends think about me as maybe they hear about this, friends at school or friends on my basketball team, and what will they think about me if I commit myself to serve Christ in a more open manner, and when I start to make this faith really my own. And I do think that's one of the hardest things about being a Christian, is the fact that we choose to be part of this community that in the world's eyes is really despised, right? Or can be despised. And that's true of a lot of groups. A lot of groups can get a negative reputation, and Christianity, certainly, in the eyes of some, has a negative reputation. And so to identify myself with Christ, to identify myself with that community, can be kind of an uncomfortable thing. And I think that's something Jesus even takes into account when he tells us to count the cost. And he says, unless you hate your father and mother, and that whole list, right? He says, you're not worthy of me. And so part of being a Christian, a Christ follower, is caring more about Christ's opinion of me, or how Christ sees me, how God sees me, as opposed to how other people see me, even if it's my family or what their opinions are of me. Because if their opinion comes first, then at some point I'm going to be tempted to give up Christ. I think that's also true when we talk about evangelism. We're, of course, worried about how the person we're evangelizing to will think of us at times. But I do think there are instances where sometimes we're trying to connect with other people or evangelize to a certain person or a certain type of person that might be despised by other people, maybe for lifestyle choices, maybe for certain outspoken opinions that they have. And so it can be a tremendous challenge. There can be two things that kind of deter us from evangelizing. It's what the person I'm evangelizing to will think of me, but then it's also, okay, what will people think of me when I talk to this person, when I associate with this person? There are some people that have negative reputations, and to attach ourselves to them in any way, shape, or form, we're worried about how that'll make us look and how people will perceive us. I think you have an example of this with Jesus in Luke chapter 19, where that's the story of Jesus and Zacchaeus. And I wish that in our Bibles it spelled his name in a non-confusing manner. I don't know if you ever looked at how Zacchaeus is spelled, so if I misspelled it on my slides at some point, I apologize for that. But anyways, Zacchaeus is one of those that was despised, and we'll talk about why. He was somebody that was not a popular guy by any means, and so Jesus certainly isn't worried about what Zacchaeus will think of him, but we do see in this context that there are people that develop an opinion about Jesus because Jesus is talking to Zacchaeus, and because Jesus invites himself into Zacchaeus' home. And so we could say that Zacchaeus was despised. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and start in Luke chapter 19. And if I could just get a volunteer to read verses 1 through 10, just one person to read through that for us. And as you read through that, kind of as we've done every week, I want you to be paying attention to what we learn about Zacchaeus, what stands out to you about him, and then also maybe what we see in the crowds and what we learn about them. So if we have a volunteer to read that, go for it. All right, and my clicker's not working, so we don't need slides. It's fine. We'll just stick with the text tonight. Sometimes it's better that way. But who is present in this scene as we kind of set the scene? You know, where does it take place? But also, who's present other than Jesus and Zacchaeus? What do you see there? Yeah, so in Luke's account, that's like 1 or 2 stories away, actually. So yeah, that's coming up really quickly. At this point, Jesus has set his face towards Jerusalem, is the way Luke puts it, and he's really close. Jericho is about 17 miles away outside of Jerusalem, and you'll notice that there's large crowds that are gathered around him. In fact, we see that there's already large crowds as he's drawing near to Jericho. If you look at chapter 18, it says in verse 35, as he drew near to Jericho, a blind man was sitting by the roadside and begging, and hearing a crowd going by, he inquired what this meant. So as Jesus is coming into Jericho, there's already a large crowd to the extent that this blind man hears the hustle and bustle, and he's asking what's going on. And then that story ends, actually, with the blind man. In verse 43, Jesus heals the blind man. And it says immediately he recovered his sight and followed him, glorifying God. And all the people, when they saw it, gave praise to God. And so, you know, we notice again that there's this large crowd. It's probably growing as he's getting closer and closer to Jericho, getting closer and closer to Jerusalem eventually. And what do you think is kind of the overall mood of that crowd as they arrive in Jericho? What do you think is the overall mood there amongst the people? Yeah. So there's excitement. You know, obviously that excitement gets ramped up when he heals this guy publicly that, you know, everybody would have known was blind and had been blind for some time. How do you notice the crowd's mood change a little bit in this story about Zacchaeus? They go from glorifying God and glorifying Jesus, I take that, and then how does their mood kind of change halfway through the story here of Zacchaeus? Yeah, they're grumbling, right? And why are they grumbling? Yeah, he's going to be with Zacchaeus, this sinner, right? And so it's just interesting to me that they here they're glorifying God, and then they see who he's associating with, and they go from, I think, being excited to being a little bit jaded as they see who Jesus is hanging out with. Why does Zacchaeus get this special attention? Why does he have to stay at Zacchaeus' house? Doesn't he know what kind of guy he is? I think it's kind of the sense of what's going on here. So what do we learn about Zacchaeus? What stands out to you guys about him? I think that there's some specific things mentioned in verses 2 and 3, but what do you guys notice about him that is either explicit or maybe implied in the text? Okay, he's short and he's eager. Yeah, it's true. He's seeking Jesus, isn't he? He knows Jesus is coming. He's excited to see him. He just wants to catch a glimpse of him. And so we see his eagerness when he climbs up the tree, but we also see his eagerness when Jesus calls him and he hurries down and welcomes Jesus with joy. So there's some excitement, some eagerness there. He's short in stature. What else? Okay, he's rich and he's a tax collector. So again, how did we know the answer to this question? But how did people view tax collectors in those days? Right, favorably or unfavorably? Right, and we were talking a Tuesday morning men's class. Or actually, no, this was probably somebody else yesterday, I guess. But when you have tax collector and sinner always mentioned in the same breath, right? Those two things go hand in hand. Gives you a pretty good indication of what people thought. But Zacchaeus, was he just another tax collector? What else is specifically said about him when it came to? Right, so he's chief tax collector. And that word's interesting because it's not used anywhere else, not only in your Bibles, but it's not found in any other source in history. Like it's only found here in Luke. But the idea here, I think, is that he's like first amongst the tax collectors. And Jericho would have been a significant trade route. It would have been a place that they would use for exporting goods from either side of the Jordan, from the west to the east and the east to the west side, from Judea into Perea on the other side. And so you can imagine this is a place that is probably got a lot of money and goods that are passing through. And so when it says that Zacchaeus was a tax collector, this is why I say this is Jesus and the despised, right? They already don't like him for this. But when it tells us that he was a rich tax collector, what are some things that are implied by that? Did he get rich, because he had some wealthy parents and he inherited their money, or what's more likely here? Okay, he took from the poor. Yeah, and so I think that's kind of implied when Zacchaeus, he's repenting and he says, if I've defrauded anybody, and basically how that would work is if you were sent to collect, $100, right? The way that a tax collector would make more money is they would say, well, I need 125, and they'd keep 25 for themselves, right? And so Zacchaeus has this reputation built up where people look at him and they just outright call him a sinner when they see Jesus going to associate with him. And then the fact that he's short, I wonder if that made him an easy target. He's already somebody that people don't like, and then maybe having small stature, he was perhaps, we don't know this for sure, but I could imagine him being picked on pretty easily, being short and being somebody that they already don't like. So those are kind of the explicit things. Is there anything that's kind of implied in the text that stands out to you about Zacchaeus as far as what we learned about him? Yeah, he seems to have some level of faith where, again, it says he's seeking Jesus and he's not able to see him in the crowds, and so he knows the direction Jesus is going and he runs ahead of him and climbs up the sycamore tree, we say, and that's something that children would have done. That's not something that an adult, grown man does. I don't know about you, but I'm approaching 30. I don't want to say I'm 30. I'm only 29. And the idea of climbing up a tree isn't very appealing for me at 29, but here's Zacchaeus, who knows what age he is, and he's so excited to see Jesus that he's climbing up a tree just to get a glimpse of him, right? So this would be like the closest thing I can think of is when sometimes you see the motorcades coming through when a president is in town in a really busy city, and everybody, they just want to get a glimpse. If they can't get a glimpse of the person, they just want a glimpse of the motorcade, right? Wow, I saw the president's motorcade going by. That's almost the kind of sensationalism that you get a sense of surrounding Jesus as he enters Jericho and is on his way to Jerusalem, as the people have high hopes about Jesus. So anything else stand out to you guys about Zacchaeus? I keep picking this up, but my PowerPoint's not working. Happy, yeah, he's immediately, Jesus says, I must come to your house, and Zacchaeus is like, he's excited to have him, isn't he? He welcomes him with joy. Anything else? I mean, I assume that he knew who Jesus was. I think, as Larry said, I don't think this would have been the first time Jesus was coming through Jericho. In verse 3, it says he was seeking to see Jesus, or who Jesus was, and maybe that's just, you hear stories about somebody, but you don't have TV, you don't have a newspaper, you hear stories, but you've never seen the guy. And so you want to put a face to these stories that you've heard. I'd imagine maybe that's what it is. But yeah, probably hasn't seen him face to face. Maybe that's what's going on too. I hadn't thought about that. It's a good point. Anybody else? Yeah, go ahead, Becky. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I take that as he's saying, this is what I'm going to do going forward, and he doesn't seem to deny it, which is interesting as well. Good point. Anybody else? Okay, so as we do throughout this class and what we've done throughout this whole quarter, who reminds us, who might we come across, what type of individual might we come across in our day-to-day lives that remind us of a Zacchaeus? And of course, we're thinking beyond somebody who's short, right? Okay, let's go a little deeper than that. But who might this kind of remind us of? I have a couple thoughts, but this one's a trickier one in some ways. Okay, used car salesman. I have that in my notes. Somebody who, what I'd write, someone that makes a living through a career that has negative stereotypes, right? So lawyers. My dad was a realtor, so he always got a hard time for that. Some people made fun of him for being a realtor. A lot of people don't trust realtors, I guess. Imagine that. But yeah, there's something to that. What else? I was thinking about what if we simplify it? Anybody that is despised by a group of people, right? When we boil it down to that, how easy is it for somebody to start despising somebody else, maybe based off of some, I think, especially outspoken political beliefs? So if you're in a certain part of the city or of this country and somebody walks in wearing a bright red MAGA hat, is everybody going to have just receive that person warmly as they walk in with that? A MAGA hat. MAGA, Make America Great Again, Donald Trump, right? So likewise, if you know somebody or you see somebody that maybe has a Biden-Harris bumper sticker, there's some people that are going to be tempted to treat them a little bit differently. As soon as I see your political affiliations, I despise you, right? Is that something that we see? And it's fueled by the fact that we surround ourselves with people that have similar political beliefs, and they'll despise that person when they see him, and so that tempts me to do the same. So I think that we certainly see that. How about somebody at work that just doesn't have a great reputation? All right, think about that person at work that nobody likes, that everybody kind of perceives as being a little bit dishonest. He's willing to throw just about anybody under the bus, do whatever it takes to get ahead. Maybe he or she is somewhat lazy. Maybe there's somebody that is willing to take advantage of a coworker or take advantage of an employee or dishonestly take advantage of a client. Can anybody imagine somebody like that? I had a boss at Costco, and nobody liked this poor lady. I mean, she wasn't my favorite boss, but I didn't really understand the level of disdain that they had for this boss that I had. And just to give you an idea, one of my managers, this was a guy, and then this lady that he didn't like, that nobody liked, she was a little bit higher up than him. And I remember him showing me a picture, like right when I started there. He's like, "Hey, do you want to see a picture of Deb that I have on my phone?" And he shows me a Halloween skeleton wearing a dress. So that gives you an idea. That was another manager that was saying that. And so pretty much everybody that worked on the night crew, nobody liked this lady at all. For one reason or another. I never really fully understood the level of hatred and disdain that they had for her. And I never joined in that, but I don't think that that's enough. And let me ask this. Do you think somebody who is disliked by their coworkers or disliked by their employees, do you think they're ignorant of that? Do you think that's something that they're not aware of? I think there's been times where I've been disliked by coworkers or been disliked by a boss, and maybe you just mess up the first day and everybody thinks you're an idiot going forward, and it's really hard to recover from that. But I look back on that, and sure, I didn't join in, but I wonder how much would I have stood out had I just treated her like she was a human being, had I been nice to her, had I recognized her, had I gone out of my way to do something nice for her. You know, here everybody is treating her pretty horribly, talking behind her back. She's coming around the corner, they're saying, shh, stop talking, she's right there. You know, I kind of imagine Zacchaeus that way. This is somebody nobody liked. When he comes around the corner, everybody stops talking about him. Zacchaeus, I think that he could see in people's faces. Maybe it wasn't just what they said to him, but the expression on their faces as he walked by or as he approached them. You know, I imagine him being kind of a lonely guy. Anyways, those are some thoughts that popped into my mind as far as who this might remind me of. And I'll say that in the case with that boss, I didn't join in, but there has certainly been other cases where a group of people, a group of friends, or a group of coworkers didn't like somebody, and it was just so easy to join in on that. And just, yeah, I don't like them either, and that's how you fit in with everybody. And anyways, we see Jesus going against that, don't we? So if you can't think of anybody that nobody likes at work, the scary thing is it might be you. No, I'm just kidding. So I want to ask, what did Jesus do? Unless you guys have other thoughts about who Zacchaeus reminds you of. If not, we'll move on. So what does Jesus do? What does Jesus do as far as to reach this guy, to connect with this guy that stands out to you all? All right, so he invites him. He says, I must stay at your house. I don't know if that means for the afternoon, or I kind of assume that means overnight, probably. But he invites himself over to his house, which, how unorthodox is that, even today? Especially back then. I think it was even more unorthodox. Here, Jesus invites himself over. When I was growing up, if I invited myself over to a friend's house, and my mom and dad found out about it, then they overruled me and they said, nope, you're not allowed to go because you invited yourself over. That's not what you do, right? But here Jesus, he invites himself over to this guy's house, says, I must stay at your house. Why does Jesus do that? What does that accomplish? Sorry, what did you say? Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's a little different when it's somebody like Jesus. If Zacchaeus even has, a quarter of the realization of who Jesus is, that's going to be pretty intimidating to go up to Jesus and say, hey, will you come over to my house, right? So you got the greater and the lesser saying, hey, I want to come over to your house. That would be a great honor, wouldn't it? But why else do you think Jesus does this? Invites himself into Zacchaeus' house. And what's the application for us? Do we just invite ourselves into people's homes? Is that what we should do? Probably not. Yeah. And that comes across really clearly with Zacchaeus, because I think a lot of the Gospels, you have Jesus connecting with the poor and the people that are kind of downcast and have had a pretty miserable existence. We've seen a lot of that in this class. And so you could be tempted as you're reading the Gospels to think Jesus isn't for the rich, right? Well, here you have Jesus, and he's extending himself to this rich guy. And he is for the rich as well. And so not just the poor, but the rich also. Let's think a little bit deeper about this. What does it actually accomplish when Jesus invites himself over to into Zacchaeus' house? What is that really accomplishing? Other than, okay, he went into his house, but what does that really accomplish? What is he doing there? Okay. All right. Anybody else? Yeah, and definitely it's a message that is given to the crowds, that's for sure, as they react to it publicly. Anybody else? I think really what he's doing here, and I think this is the application, at least that I take away from it, we make a big deal out of how Jesus does this, and insofar that he invites himself into this guy's house. I don't think that that's necessarily the application for us, but I think what we can do is invite ourselves into people's lives, right? I think that's really what Jesus is accomplishing here by inviting himself into Zacchaeus' house. He's inviting himself into the life of Zacchaeus. How well did Zacchaeus know Jesus up to this point? Yeah, it's word of mouth. Dan brought out, I think that he probably hadn't even seen his face before. This is just a guy he had most likely heard stories about. And when Jesus invites himself into his house, what's going to change about the relationship? He's going to get to know him a lot. Sorry, what? Yeah, it becomes personal, right? And Jesus gets to know Zacchaeus. It's kind of unfair to say because Jesus has perfect knowledge, but for us, we get to know that person when we invite ourselves into their lives. Maybe that's just introducing ourselves. Maybe that's taking somebody out to lunch, whatever it might be. But I think that's the application that I take away. Go ahead, Becky. Mm-hmm. That the massive crowd didn't? I think just the tremendous effort that he went through. Here's a guy that's small, so he's not even able to get a glimpse of Jesus. I imagine somebody that is of normal stature is able to see Jesus. And here's a guy that he literally runs ahead of the crowd, goes through the effort of climbing up this tree. And I guess if you imagine yourself, put yourself in Jesus' shoes and look at it in the eyes of Jesus. You are walking through the city, and sure, you have all these people that are pressing up against you, but then you see this adult man in a tree just trying to get a glimpse of you. I mean, if you're Jesus, I think that's gonna stand out. And so he sees him and he calls him down. At least that's, I don't know if that really answers your question, but yeah. Yeah. Well, maybe it's partly answered by how this finishes in verse 10, where Jesus says, the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. Zacchaeus, although he was rich and he was a tax collector, going back to the Sermon on the Mount, he had all this stuff, but he was poor in spirit, and maybe on a level that even the crowds, a lot of people in the crowds weren't, and recognized that Zacchaeus was somebody that's diligently seeking, and Jesus is seeking those who are seeking him. But I think it helps being Jesus, being able to see somebody's heart. There's something he saw in Jesus, and or in Zacchaeus, that maybe I don't have all the answers to, but saw something, and I think it does send a message to the crowds as well, as Larry and Andy brought out. What's that? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Go ahead, Anel. You had your hand up. Yeah. Oh, 100%. I mean, everybody else seemed to treat him like they're done with this guy. They're going to deal with him as little as possible. Mm-hmm.
So, that makes other people automatically think that there's got to be something about it that must be good because Jesus is taking the time to talk to him, to visit with him, where they had never tried.
Yeah, and Jesus willingly, he willingly steps foot into a house that I don't think any of those other people in the crowd would have ever willingly stepped foot into. And so, yeah, I think there's definitely something to what you're saying. Go ahead, Ronnie. Yeah, and so I guess, to me, I think back to my boss, Deb. Nobody liked her. I shouldn't have said her name, but she's probably not going to watch this. anyways, nobody liked her. I think it would have stood out to her if you had individuals inviting themselves into her life. Even if that's finding something to appreciate about her. Everybody else is whispering as she comes around the corner, and she knows it's about her. What if I, found something genuinely to express appreciation towards her for, little things like that. I think that when we come across or when we have people in our lives that are despised, that nobody likes, man, that's a tremendous opportunity for us to stand out in that person's life and to treat them differently. That's going to stand out to them, I think. Anyways, go ahead, Lori, and then Amy. Yeah, no, that's totally true. And what's curious about that to me is that, like what you just said, Jesus says that to the Pharisees, but he basically has a similar message, I think, in his actions towards the crowds. And I think it just goes to show that type of ugly attitude, it can occur in anybody. Like you could think, oh, I'm poor, I'm lowly, I'm the guy that Jesus came to save, and this rich tax collector, Jesus doesn't mess with those guys. It almost seems like what's going on in the crowds. Like, why? If he knew who this Zacchaeus guy was, he wouldn't be doing this. But yeah, great point. Amy, go ahead. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. That's just a chapter earlier, right? I think there's totally meant to be a contrast there. Yeah, Amy, I appreciate you bringing that out. So if you look at what Zacchaeus actually says in verse 8, he says, it says, Zacchaeus stood and said to the Lord, which I kind of wonder what this scene really actually looks like, because the crowd is grumbling when they see Jesus went into his house, I think. And I think Zacchaeus is sitting down with Jesus in his house and then stands up in the middle of that meal. So I'm picturing this. Is this like where Jesus healed the paralyzed man when they lowered him into the rafters and he had people that were crowding around the house? Maybe that's kind of a similar thing that's going on. I don't know. But when you look at what Zacchaeus actually says, as Amy just pointed out, he says, behold, half my goods I give to the poor, and if I've defrauded anyone of anything, I restore it fourfold. The key word there is if. And again, to use my poor ex-boss as an example, I think that what happened with her is maybe one or two people started not to like her, and then she just became a fun person not to like. And again, as some of the managers didn't like her, it's a great way to get that manager's approval if you start telling funny jokes about this boss that your manager also doesn't like. And I think that that's so easy. That happens so often where we just start making assumptions about people based off of an attitude that one person has, and we all just kind of go with it. And we see that all the time, as Amy said, with generally with lawyers, but I think just in individuals. When we step into a new role at a workplace and here's this person, oh, if nobody likes this person, stay away from them, and then we just kind of go with it, right? That's an opportunity for us to stand out, I guess, is what I'm getting at, rather than going with the crowd. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it's just because it's so easy to do. It almost feels like human nature just to judge a book by its cover is the expression I think you used. And, yeah. Yep.
I mean, we have so many things that we use for excuses that I often wonder if God could hear us and talk to us, would He really get grab of our thoughts?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, the illustration that's often given is, if you had a tape recorder playing and recording all your thoughts, on video and on audio, and then we, played it up here on the projector for the whole church to be, how ashamed would we all be about the thoughts we've had about others, and yeah.
He knew their thoughts when He was walking through the crowd, so, He already could hear what they were saying,
Yeah.
now, before He even got close enough to Him to tell Him to come down.
Yeah, or maybe he sees this poor guy's trying to see him, and nobody's getting out the way to help this guy see Jesus, maybe even. Yeah, that's a great point. What else stands out to us about Jesus and what he does here? Invites himself into this guy's life, but what else? Yeah. Yeah, because we get the impression Zacchaeus doesn't really know all that much about him, but he's trying to get a glimpse of him. So naturally, we can assume this is a condensed version of what actually took place that day. And Zacchaeus, whatever that conversation was, there's no doubt was more teaching. And probably Zacchaeus learned more about Jesus after Jesus leaves and is crucified, and then here's stories about him being risen from the dead, certainly. I guess one thing that stands out to me is, and I don't mean this from a salvation standpoint, I mean this from a purely, human interaction level. Jesus didn't demand change in order for him to start that initial involvement in Zacchaeus' life. He didn't expect Zacchaeus to right all his wrongs before Jesus was willing to give him the time of day. And because of that, because Jesus was willing to engage, that's actually the thing that leads Zacchaeus to be transformed, I think. And I think sometimes we want it to be the other way around. But as Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, it's let your light shine. And so that other people, when they see your good works, will glorify your Father who's in heaven. I think sometimes we want people to glorify our Father who's in heaven, and then we'll let our light shine, right? But that's not what Jesus does here. He engages with this guy before he makes the changes that all the crowds want to see Zacchaeus make. And I think thirdly, what I have in my notes as well, is that Jesus' presence, just his presence, I think motivates this commitment or this change in Zacchaeus. So when these accusations are being shouted out from the crowds, really all it says is that they said he was a sinner. I imagine there's probably more that was said. That's probably just the short of it as far as what they're saying about Zacchaeus. You notice that Zacchaeus doesn't dig his heels in and doubles down or tries to deny it. He has Jesus there, and Jesus has this reputation for somebody of truth and of honesty and of righteousness. And I think sometimes if we have that reputation, we can, just our presence in somebody's life, that can be the thing that motivates them to make the necessary changes. That's why it's so important that we work on being a people of honesty. If you're working with somebody in the workplace and they have a tendency of being dishonest, but you have this reputation of always being honest with your clients or with other coworkers or with your boss, and you're working on a project together, how hard is it going to be for them to do something that's dishonest if you have this reputation for always being honest? It's like when we have clean language. How awkward does it make it for some people to cuss around us? I think some of us have been in those situations where they ask, why don't you talk the way everybody else talks? Or why don't you smoke and drink the way everybody else goes out and smokes and drinks, after work or whatever it might be. I think there's something healthy about that, as uncomfortable as it is, to have a presence in people's lives that motivates them to make changes. And I see that in Jesus here with Zacchaeus. Go ahead. Yeah. Yeah. Right. And that's not, we can go too far with that where we're constantly turning our noses down at somebody every time somebody in the world does something that's, the Scripture says they shouldn't. But if we just have this reputation and we're doing what the Bible says, I think our presence in the lives of others can really go a long way in motivating them to make changes. Does anything stand out to you about what Jesus doesn't do? It's kind of curious to me. So Jesus, the squabble is kind of starting between Zacchaeus and these crowds. Does Jesus interject himself in between that? I don't know, it's just kind of curious to me that Jesus doesn't get on the crowds and he doesn't get on Zacchaeus to explain himself. And maybe as Larry was saying, there's in this case as well, there's some that we're missing that we don't have. But I think Jesus kind of had a tendency to let other people to have a responsibility to make the changes they need to make, in other words. That he wasn't interested in controlling all the intimate details about somebody's life. I guess what I think about is Luke 12, right, where you have these two brothers that are arguing, and that's in verse 13, and it says, someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." But Jesus said to him, "Man, who made me a judge and arbiter over you?" I think Jesus' approach with Zacchaeus is just to be this influence in his life, to address the spiritual problems in Zacchaeus' life. And if Zacchaeus is truly converted by his faith in Jesus, by who Jesus is, that's going to naturally solve other problems in his life. In other words, I think sometimes we try to address the symptoms of problems in people's lives without actually getting to what the root cause is. And really the root cause is always spiritual, right? It's always a disconnect from God. And if we can fix that problem, if we can get somebody to Jesus, it's going to slowly start working out the other problems in their lives. But lastly, I want to mention the other thing about Jesus here, and I'll finish with this, is that Jesus' actions, are they influenced or impacted by the crowd? In other words, as soon as Jesus makes this decision, it's almost like the crowd starts turning on him a little bit too. And they start, throwing out insults about Zacchaeus. Does that kind of intimidate Jesus or cause him not to want to be sitting with Zacchaeus anymore? No, it doesn't seem like it, right? He just persists. He remains there, and I think that's really a lesson for us. I think when we're growing up, we think this is a kid problem, right? That, that's the unpopular, uncool kid. And we think as adults we don't do this. But I beg to differ. I think we do this as adults all the time. And Jesus is not at all interested in what people think about this guy. Jesus is going to make up his own opinions. He's going to be his own man. He's not going to go with the crowd. Go ahead, Becky. Yeah, we deserve it, right? Yeah, he doesn't deserve it at least, yeah. Yeah, totally. It's a prime example of shining your light, right? Shining your light into darkness there. Go ahead, Margaret.
I have a thought that I wanted to share, but I was afraid to do it until I found it. So what it made me think of is in Luke 6:32, if you love those who love you, how great is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. So
That's right.
teaching them that it kind of backs that up.
Yeah, Jesus is practicing what he preached. I'll leave you with this quote that stood out to me. One person said that grace is a scandal. He's making the point that it's always scandalous, grace is. Grace is a scandal because it insists on including those whom we would wish to exclude. The story of Zacchaeus illustrates such grace. It ends not with Zacchaeus seeking Jesus, but in Jesus seeking him, not in Zacchaeus' moral perfection, but with his recovery and restoration as a son of Abraham. And I just really like that idea. That is true of grace, isn't it? What if God expected us to right all our wrongs before we could come to him? We'd all be damned to hell, wouldn't we? And so I think that we see this example of Jesus. We see a better way where he's the one. He's not waiting for people just to seek him, but he's setting out to seek and save the lost. And so he's a tremendous example of that in this text. Any other thoughts as we wrap up? Comments, questions? All right, thanks. Appreciate it.